A millionaire with only 24 hours to live pretended to be an unemployed man looking for a job in his own company to see whom he would leave it to. After being ignored by everyone, the millionaire was living his final moments in the lobby when the cleaner did something that left everyone in shock. Ricardo Taylor was the type of man who commanded the attention of a room just by entering it, with his 58 years carried with the elegance of someone who had conquered everything money could buy. His grey hair was impeccably combed back, his beard trimmed with millimetric precision, framing a face marked by decades of difficult decisions and sleepless nights. The perfectly cut Italian suit couldn't completely hide his slightly slumped shoulders, the result of years bent over contracts and construction projects. His brown eyes, which had intimidated hundreds of competitors in negotiations, now carried a shadow of fatigue that no amount of money could erase. His hands, which had signed million-dollar contracts and shaken the hands of the most powerful people in the city, trembled slightly as they held the results of his medical tests. It must be just stress, he thought, trying to convince himself of something that deep down he already knew wasn't true. The doctor's office had walls that were too white, too silent, and Ricardo Taylor was sitting there alone, watching the doctor shuffling papers with an expression that didn't promise good news. The doctor raised his eyes, adjusted his glasses, and took a deep breath before starting to speak. Ricardo had been through many difficult meetings in his life, closed million-dollar deals, fired hundreds of people, but nothing had prepared him for that moment. The doctor placed the test results on the table, pointed to a dark spot on the result, and began to explain in a grave and measured voice, "Mr. Taylor, I need to be direct with you because time is crucial here. This spot you're seeing here indicates a very rare cardiac condition, something we see perhaps once in an entire medical career," said the doctor, maintaining a professional but compassionate tone. Ricardo felt his entire body go cold as he processed those words, his hands instinctively gripping the arms of the chair where he was sitting. The 58-year-old businessman who had built an empire from scratch, who had transformed a small construction company into one of the largest in the country, was now there, trying to understand what this meant for his future. His hands began to tremble slightly, and he hid them under the table, maintaining the upright posture he always kept in moments of crisis. The doctor took a glass of water from the dispenser beside him and offered it to him, realizing that the patient was having difficulty processing the information. "The walls of your heart are deteriorating rapidly, Mr. Taylor. Any strong emotion, any greater effort can make everything end instantly. There is no possible treatment, no surgery that can reverse this condition," the doctor explained, each word weighing like lead in the air. Ricardo drank the water slowly, feeling the cold liquid go down his throat, while 1,000 thoughts ran through his mind like an uncontrolled hurricane. He placed the glass on the table carefully, noticing how his hands were still trembling slightly, and looked directly at the doctor, needing to hear the complete truth without beating around the bush or false hopes. "Doctor, I need to know exactly how much time I have left. I don't want optimistic estimates, I want the raw truth, as difficult as it may be," Ricardo asked, surprised by the firmness of his own voice. 24 hours, Mr. Taylor. Maybe less if you don't get absolute rest. Your heart can stop at any moment from now on," the doctor replied, and those words echoed in the room like a final sentence. Ricardo rose from his chair abruptly. His legs seemed made of cotton, but he managed to keep his balance and walk to the office window, needing to see the world outside, needing to connect with something beyond those four walls that seemed to be closing in on him. Down below, the city continued its frantic pace, people rushing to their appointments, cars honking in traffic, life following its normal course while his was coming to an end. The doctor also stood up, approaching him carefully as if Ricardo might break at any moment. "Mr. Taylor, you should call your family immediately. Call someone to stay by your side at this moment, someone who can help you with the necessary preparations," the doctor suggested with a compassionate voice. Ricardo turned to face the doctor, a bitter smile forming on his lips as he thought about the irony of that well-intentioned suggestion. Family was something he had never built, too busy erecting buildings and closing contracts to think about building emotional bonds with someone. "Doctor, I've dedicated my entire life to work. I don't have a wife, I don't have children, I don't have living siblings. Taylor Construction is my only family, and I doubt buildings and contracts can keep me company now," he confessed, his voice heavy with a melancholy he had never allowed to surface before. The doctor seemed genuinely touched by the confession, placing his hand on Ricardo's shoulder in a gesture of human solidarity. The businessman could see in the doctor's eyes a mixture of pity and understanding, something he hadn't seen for a long time in the looks of people around him. "Then perhaps you should think about how you would like to spend these last hours. Do something you've always wanted to do. Resolve pending matters, organize your legacy," the doctor advised, trying to offer some kind of guidance in that impossible moment. Ricardo nodded slowly, already beginning to formulate a plan in his mind, something he had learned to do throughout his business life, transforming crises into opportunities for action. He thanked the doctor with a firm handshake, took his test results and walked toward the door, each step deliberate and measured so as not to accelerate his already fragile heart too much. "Thank you for your honesty, Doctor. It's rare to find people who don't try to sugarcoat when the situation is serious. I will use these 24 hours well," Ricardo promised before leaving. The elevator in the medical building seemed like a time capsule as Ricardo descended the 20 floors to the ground level, each passing floor representing another moment of his limited life slipping away. When the doors opened on the ground floor, he walked through the Italian marble lobby, his steps echoing in the vast space, and went out to the street where his private driver was waiting with the imported car. "To the company, Mr. Taylor?" asked the driver, already opening the rear door of the vehicle. "Yes, but drop me off a block before. I want to walk a bit. I need to think," replied Ricardo, settling into the soft leather seat. During the journey, he observed the city through the window, seeing the buildings he had constructed, the ongoing works with his company's logo, the billboards announcing new developments he would never see completed. Each construction was a part of him that would remain after he was gone, but suddenly that no longer seemed enough. When the car stopped at the indicated spot, Ricardo got out and dismissed the driver. "You can go home. I won't need your services anymore today," he said, leaving the employee confused but unquestioning. Taylor Construction occupied an entire 30-story building in the financial center of the city, a mirrored glass tower that reflected the sky and clouds as if wanting to camouflage itself among them. Ricardo entered through the main entrance, greeted the doorman with a nod, and went straight up to his office on the top floor using his private elevator. The space was immense, decorated with Italian design furniture, paintings by renowned artists, and a panoramic view of the city that took any visitor's breath away. He walked to the window and stood there, observing everything he had achieved. "All this, and in the end I'll die alone like an abandoned dog," he muttered to himself, the reality of his situation weighing on his shoulders. It was then that an idea began to form in his mind, something bold and perhaps even a little insane, but that made perfect sense at that moment. He had spent his entire life building that company, hiring people, creating jobs, but had never really known who worked for him beyond reports and formal meetings. If he was going to leave all that to someone, he needed to know who deserved to inherit his empire, who had enough character to continue his legacy. "I'm going to find out who really has value in this company. I'll see how they treat me when they don't know who I am," he decided aloud, already beginning to elaborate his plan. Ricardo walked to the private bathroom in his office and looked at himself in the mirror, seeing the man he had become. Perfectly combed grey hair, well-trimmed beard, impeccable Italian suit. He began to undo that carefully constructed image, messing up his hair with his hands, loosening his tie until removing it completely, taking off the expensive jacket and leaving only the dress shirt. In the closet he kept in the office for emergencies, he found simpler pants and worn shoes that he used to visit construction sites. Perfect. "Now I look like just another desperate unemployed person looking for an opportunity," he said to his reflection in the mirror. He went down the emergency stairs to avoid meeting anyone familiar in the main elevators, each step demanding effort from his weakened heart. On the 15th floor, he needed to stop to catch his breath, feeling his chest tighten slightly, a reminder that time was running against him. He leaned against the cold wall of the emergency corridor, breathing slowly and deeply as the doctor had recommended. "Calm down, Ricardo. You need to get to the ground floor. You need to discover the truth before it's too late," he said to himself, using his own voice as an anchor. When he finally reached the Human Resources Department floor on the 5th floor, Ricardo took a deep breath and assumed a different posture. Shoulders slightly drooped, less confident gaze, the body language of someone who desperately needs a job. He pushed the glass door and entered the spacious area where several people were waiting for interviews, sitting in uncomfortable chairs, holding resumes with nervous hands. The receptionist, a young woman he didn't recognize, looked up from her computer and analyzed him from head to toe. "Yes, sir. Are you here for the General Services Assistant position?" she asked in a tone that mixed boredom and superiority. "Yes, I came to see if there's any opportunity. I really need to work. I have experience in various areas," Ricardo replied, forcing himself to appear humble and needy. The receptionist rolled her eyes almost imperceptibly, but Ricardo noticed, and it hurt him more than it should have. She typed something on the computer, then looked at him again with a bored expression. "Full name, please." "I'll see if we still have openings, but I'll tell you up front that chances are minimal for people without specific qualifications," she said, each word loaded with disdain. "Hudson Wright," Ricardo lied, using the first name that came to his mind. The young woman typed the name into the system, frowning when she obviously found no record. She was about to say something when the main office door opened and the human resources manager appeared, a man Ricardo had personally hired 5 years earlier. "What's going on here? Why are there people without appointments in the reception?" the manager questioned, looking directly at Ricardo with irritation. The receptionist quickly explained the situation, and the manager approached Ricardo with firm steps, stopping right in front of him with an intimidating posture. Ricardo could smell the man's expensive perfume, the same type he used to wear himself, and the irony of the situation didn't go unnoticed. "Sir, we don't have positions for people who show up without appointments. Our selection process is rigorous and goes through several stages. You should have sent your resume through the website first," the manager said with a cutting voice. "I understand, but I thought maybe I could leave my resume in person. Sometimes one chance is all we need in life," Ricardo tried, keeping a hopeful tone. The manager laughed, a dry sound without humor that echoed through the environment. Other department employees had stopped what they were doing to observe the scene, some with expressions of pity, others clearly enjoying the embarrassment of others. "A chance? Sir, do you think this is a charity house?" "We have standards to maintain," the manager replied, his voice rising enough for everyone to hear. Ricardo felt his heart accelerate with the humiliation, and immediately a sharp pain shot through his chest like lightning. He instinctively brought his hand to his chest, trying to disguise the gesture, as if he were just adjusting his shirt, but the pain was increasing. He needed to leave, needed to calm down before his heart gave out completely. "Sorry for the inconvenience, I'll leave," he said in a weak voice, turning to exit. But when he took the first step toward the door, dizziness came like a violent wave, making the world spin around him. Ricardo tried to support himself on a nearby chair, but his legs gave way, and he fell to his knees on the cold floor of the Human Resources Department. The pain in his chest was now unbearable, as if someone were squeezing his heart with an iron hand. "Help, please," he managed to whisper, but his voice came out so weak it was barely heard. The people around completely stopped. Some employees rose from their desks, but no one approached. Ricardo could hear distant voices, comments about calling security, about not getting involved, about possible legal problems. The receptionist picked up the phone, but instead of calling an ambulance, she called security. "We have a problem here in Human Resources. A man fell ill. I think he's pretending to get attention," she said, her voice cold and professional. Ricardo tried to raise his head to ask for help again, but his vision was getting increasingly darker at the edges, as if someone was slowly turning off the lights. He could feel the cold floor against his face now. He had fallen completely, and the sound of voices around him was becoming more and more distant. "Please, someone," and he tried to say, but wasn't sure if the words had actually left his mouth. The human resources manager approached, but kept a safe distance, as if Ricardo were contagious. From the floor, Ricardo could see the man's expensive shoes, shoes that had probably been bought with the generous salary that he himself approved every month. "Sir, you need to get up and leave. You're causing a disturbance here." "If you don't leave willingly, I'll have to call the police," threatened the manager, completely oblivious to the gravity of the situation. But Ricardo couldn't respond, couldn't move, could barely breathe. His heart was failing, exactly as the doctor had warned, and he was about to die there on the cold floor of his own company, surrounded by people who wouldn't lift a finger to help him. With each irregular beat, it felt as if knives were piercing his chest, and air simply wouldn't reach his lungs no matter how desperately he tried to draw it in. He could clearly hear the conversations around him, people discussing who would be responsible if he died there, about possible lawsuits, about the disruption this would cause to the workday. "Has anyone taken a photo? We need proof that he was already unwell when he arrived here," said a female voice that Ricardo recognized as belonging to the legal department assistant. The human resources manager was on the phone now, not with emergency services, but with the legal department asking about the legal implications of having someone dying on company premises. Ricardo could see through the small gaps in his blurred vision that some people were filming the scene with their cell phones, not to help or document for medical assistance, but probably to share the drama on their social media. One of the interns even chuckled softly and commented to the colleague beside him about how pathetic it was to see a desperate old man seeking employment collapse like that. "I bet he's faking to get some kind of compensation." "These people do anything for money," whispered the young man, not caring if Ricardo could hear him. Ricardo tried to move his lips to ask for water, anything that would alleviate the sensation that he was drowning on dry land, but his mouth was completely dry, and his tongue seemed to have doubled in size. The tingling that had started in his extremities now climbed up his arms and legs like fire ants, and he could no longer feel his fingers. His field of vision was dangerously narrowing, as if he were looking through a tunnel that was getting smaller and smaller. "So this is how I'll die," he thought with terrifying clarity. "On the floor of the company I built, treated worse than an abandoned animal." The receptionist had moved even further away, covering her nose with her hand, as if Ricardo were contagious or had some unpleasant odor. She was frantically typing on her cell phone, probably telling friends about the drama, while occasionally looking up to check if he was still alive. The security guard had finally arrived, but instead of helping, he stood at the door, blocking the passage and preventing curious people from other floors from entering to see what was happening. "Keep your distance, folks. We don't know what he has. It could be contagious," announced the security guard, causing people to move even further away. Ricardo felt his heart beating completely erratically now, sometimes accelerating so much that it seemed like it would explode, other times almost stopping completely. During one of these terrifying pauses, he was certain that the end had come, that the next beat simply wouldn't come. Panic took hold of him, but he didn't have the energy to even show it. Tears silently ran down his face, not from physical pain, but from the deep sadness of discovering that he had wasted his entire life building something that had no soul. 58 years thrown away, he managed to think between waves of agony. Someone had turned the air conditioning to maximum, and the biting cold made his body shake uncontrollably, using up what little energy he had left. He could hear the manager saying something about cleaning the area as soon as the problem was removed, referring to him as if he were trash to be discarded. A female employee suggested throwing water on him to see if he would react, but another warned that this could worsen the situation and create more legal problems. The consensus seemed to be to leave him there until he stopped breathing or someone with authority decided what to do. "How long will it take?" someone asked impatiently, as if Ricardo were deliberately disrupting their workday. The businessman tried once more to ask for help, but what came out was just a weak moan that sounded more like the last gasp of a wounded animal. His vision was almost completely dark now, just a few spots of light dancing on the periphery. I could feel my own body giving up, organs beginning to fail in sequence, like a building being demolished floor by floor. The tingling had transformed into complete numbness, and I no longer knew where my body ended and the cold floor began. "Please, someone," I tried to whisper, but I wasn't sure if any sound had actually left my mouth. The clock on the wall showed that 15 minutes had passed since I had fallen, 15 minutes that seemed like endless hours of agony and abandonment. Ricardo could hear the phone ringing, people answering business calls as if nothing was happening. corporate life continuing its relentless march while he was dying just a few meters away. An employee even stepped over his extended legs to get coffee from the machine, muttering something about the inconvenience of having to detour. The steaming cup passed so close to his face that he could smell the aroma, reminding him of all the mornings he had drunk coffee in his luxurious office, alone, but not knowing how alone he really was. What did I build all this for? He bitterly questioned himself. The pain in his chest had spread to his back and neck, as if invisible claws were tearing him apart from the inside. Each shallow breath was a lost battle, air entering in small insufficient sips that only prolonged the agony. Ricardo could feel the cold sweat soaking his clothes, sticking his shirt to his body like a damp shroud. His eyes, half closed, caught the reflection of his face on the polished floor, unrecognizable, pale as wax, lips with a frightening bluish tone. "This isn't me," he thought deliriously. "This can't be how I end." The manager had approached a bit closer, not to help, but to check if Ricardo had any documents or identification in his pocket, probably to get rid of the problem more quickly. When he saw that he was still conscious, he immediately backed away, wiping his hands on his jacket as if he had touched something dirty. "He's still alive," he announced to the others, as if it were a terrible inconvenience. "Does anyone know how much longer this will take?" he asked irritably, looking at his watch. Ricardo felt he was floating now, his body too heavy to continue fighting, his mind beginning to disconnect from the reality around him. The voices were becoming more distant, like echoes in a deep cave, and he could no longer distinguish individual words, just a constant buzz that could be conversations or the sound of his own blood failing to circulate. The sensation was strangely familiar, like those moments between sleep and waking, except this time he was certain there would be no waking. His body seemed to be sinking into the floor, passing through the polished surface, descending deeper and deeper into an icy abyss that was slowly swallowing him. He tried to cling to some thought, some memory that would keep him present, but his mind was fragmented like a broken mirror, each piece reflecting a different moment of his wasted life. "Will anyone miss me?" he wondered, already knowing the devastating answer. The darkness at the edges of his vision was closing in rapidly, like heavy curtains being pulled by invisible hands, and in the center of that increasingly smaller tunnel, he could see the fluorescent ceiling of the office, those same lights that he had personally chosen for the building. He remembered the day he had argued with the architect about the importance of good lighting for productivity, how he had insisted on every technical detail, every specification, and now those same lights would be the last thing he would see. The tingling had completely disappeared now, replaced by a total absence of sensation, as if his body had simply ceased to exist below the neck. It was terrifying and liberating at the same time, no longer feeling the excruciating pain, but knowing that it meant the end was near. "Perhaps it's better this way," he thought with resignation, "to die before becoming a burden to someone, except that there will never be anyone for whom I could be a burden." Fragments of memories began to pass through his mind like a poorly edited film. The first time he had entered a construction site, still young and full of dreams, the smell of fresh concrete and the promise of building something grand. He remembered his mother, dead for 20 years, asking when he would give her grandchildren, and how he had always responded that work came first, that there would be time later. But later never came, and now it never would. He saw the faces of former girlfriends he had let go, because no relationship seemed worth the time it would take away from his business. Each face was a reminder of a choice made, an opportunity lost, a path not taken. "I built buildings that will last for decades," he reflected with bitter clarity, "but I didn't build a single relationship that lasted more than a few months." His last coherent thought was of deep regret, not for the deals he didn't close or the money he didn't make, but for the human connections he never made, for the love he neither gave nor received. The company Christmas parties, where he appeared out of obligation, delivered a generic speech and left before dessert. The wedding invitations from employees that he always declined, sending only an expensive gift as a substitute for his presence. The unanswered calls from distant cousins, the unresponded messages from acquaintances trying to get closer. Each small rejection, each moment when he chose work over people, now weighed on him like stones on his already failing chest. I lived as I died, he reflected with bitter irony, completely alone, and the worst part is that it was by my own choice. The first sensation Ricardo had upon regaining some level of consciousness was the unmistakable smell of cheap disinfectant mixed with something more unpleasant that he preferred not to identify. He was lying on a cold, damp floor, his cheek pressed against tiles that had seen better days, and the reality of where he was hit him like a punch. The ground-floor employee bathroom, the most poorly maintained in the entire building. Someone had dragged him there like garbage to be hidden, probably so that he wouldn't disrupt the flow at the main entrance. He tried moving his arms first, testing if he still had control over his body, and a throbbing pain shot through his chest in response. "I'm still alive," he thought with a mixture of relief and despair. But for how much longer? The effort to sit up was monumental, every muscle protesting against the movement, but Ricardo knew he couldn't stay there. If someone found him in that deplorable state, they would probably call security to remove him from the building, and he would lose his only chance to discover the truth about the people who worked for him. He leaned against the dirty wall, ignoring the suspicious stains, and slowly raised himself inch by inch until he managed to stand. The cracked mirror above the sink revealed a frightening image. His face was as pale as paper, his lips still with a slight bluish tinge, and there was a dirt stain on his cheek from where he had been lying on the floor. "I look like a sick beggar," he muttered to his reflection. "Exactly the type of person everyone here would ignore without thinking twice." With uncertain steps, Ricardo washed his face with cold water from the constantly dripping faucet, each icy drop helping to bring a little more clarity to his clouded mind. He looked at the cheap wristwatch he had put on as part of his disguise and did the math. 2 hours had passed since the doctor had given the diagnosis, which meant he had only 12 hours of life left, perhaps less considering the episode he had just experienced. He needed to act quickly, but his body seemed to have other plans, each movement requiring a conscious effort that left him even more exhausted. He took several deep breaths, trying to calm his heart that was still beating irregularly, and mentally prepared himself to leave that bathroom and face the cruelty of his own company again. "Let's go, Ricardo," he said to himself. "You built this place from scratch, you won't let it defeat you now." The bathroom door creaked when he opened it slowly, peering into the corridor to make sure there was no one from the Human Resources Department nearby who might recognize him from the previous scene. The corridor was relatively empty, just a few people walking hurriedly toward the elevators, none of them even looking in his direction. Ricardo began to walk slowly, keeping close to the wall for support if needed, and headed toward the general waiting room on the ground floor where visitors and candidates usually waited. It was a space he had personally designed to impress, with Italian leather armchairs and a panoramic view of the internal garden. But now he would see it from the perspective of someone unimportant. It will be interesting to see how they treat ordinary people in this space that should welcome everyone, he thought as he approached the glass entrance. The receptionist in the waiting room was different from the previous one, an older woman with a severe air who immediately raised her eyes from her computer when Ricardo entered. She analyzed him from head to toe, her gaze lingering on his wrinkled clothes and general state of disarray, and her expression changed from professional to hostile in a matter of seconds. Ricardo tried to sit in one of the comfortable armchairs, but before he could reach it, the woman raised her voice in an authoritative tone. "Sir, this room is only for people with scheduled meetings. Do you have any visitor badge or meeting confirmation?" she asked, already knowing the answer by his appearance. Ricardo stopped midway, his hand still extended towards the armchair, and tried to explain that he was just feeling ill and needed to rest for a moment. The receptionist showed no compassion. On the contrary, she became even more rigid in her posture, rising from her desk and positioning herself between him and the armchairs like an inflexible guardian. "Sir, if you don't have credentials or an appointment, I must ask you to leave immediately. We have strict security policies in this building," she said, her voice carrying a borrowed authority that clearly made her feel important. Ricardo looked around and saw that other people in the waiting room were observing the scene, some with expressions of agreement, others simply indifferent to his embarrassment. "I understand. I apologize for the inconvenience," he replied, turning to leave. "I just thought I could rest for a moment, but I see that not even that is allowed for someone like me." Back in the hallway, Ricardo felt a wave of nausea mixed with indignation. That waiting room, which he had designed to be welcoming, had become a symbol of exclusion, a place where only the worthy could sit. He continued walking through the corridors, now more aware of how people looked at him, or rather how they didn't look at him, their eyes passing through him as if he were invisible. He passed by the finance department and heard fragments of conversations through open doors, employees complaining about bonuses they considered low, even though the amounts would feed entire families for months. A young analyst complained on the phone that the company car he had received wasn't the model he wanted, while another discussed loudly about which five-star resort to choose for the company-paid vacation. How did I become so blind to all this? Ricardo questioned himself. How did I allow my company to fill up with people so disconnected from reality? The employee cafeteria was his next destination, a place where he had rarely set foot, always preferring to have lunch in his private office or at executive restaurants. The glass doors opened automatically, revealing a spacious and modern area with a complete buffet, all subsidized by the company. Ricardo watched in horror as employees filled their plates only to throw half the food away, chatting and laughing while wasting food that could feed dozens of needy people. A female employee picked up several fruits, took a bite of an apple, and threw the rest in the trash because it wasn't sweet enough. Another spilled coffee on a table and simply moved to a different spot instead of cleaning up, leaving the mess for the cleaning staff to resolve. "Sir, you cannot stay here if you're not an employee," said a security guard who had noticed his presence. "This space is exclusive for staff with badges." Ricardo nodded and began to withdraw, but on his way to the exit he saw something that made him stop. An elderly man, clearly a lost visitor, was standing near the entrance to the cafeteria, holding a paper with some address and trying to get someone's attention to ask for information. Person after person passed by him, some actively avoiding him, others pretending to be on the phone to avoid having to stop and help. The elderly man seemed increasingly confused and anxious, his eyes desperately searching for someone who would show the slightest willingness to help. Ricardo wanted to approach and help, but his own body was beginning to fail again, his vision becoming blurry at the edges. "I'm sorry," he whispered to the elderly man who couldn't hear him. "I created all this, and I can't even help you." Thirst began to tighten his throat like an invisible hand, and Ricardo realized he hadn't drunk anything since the glass of water at the doctor's office. He desperately needed water, something to relieve the dryness that made each breath more difficult. He saw a nearby employee break room, the door ajar revealing a modern water machine and disposable cups stacked beside it. He approached hesitantly, knowing he would probably be rejected again, but the physical need outweighed the fear of humiliation. He pushed the door slowly and found two female employees talking while preparing coffee, both well-dressed and wearing golden badges indicating management positions. "Excuse me, could I just have a cup of water?" he asked, his hoarse voice evidencing how much he needed the liquid. The two women turned to stare at him as if he had committed some serious crime by entering that space. The tallest one, with impeccably arranged blonde hair, crossed her arms and assumed an expression of profound disgust. "Sir, this break room is exclusively for employees. You cannot simply walk in here and help yourself as if it were your home," she said, in a tone that suggested he had committed the worst of sacrileges. The other woman was already picking up the internal phone, probably to call security again. Ricardo tried to explain that he was feeling ill, that he only needed a glass of water, but the words came out weak and uncoordinated. "Please, I'm feeling unwell, it's just water," he begged, hating himself for having to plead for something so basic in his own company. "If you're feeling ill, you should seek a hospital, not wander through the corridors of a private company," replied the blonde, moving to block access to the water machine. "I'll have to ask you to leave now, or I'll have to call security," she threatened, her voice loaded with an authority that Ricardo had ironically helped to build with his rigid hierarchy policies. The other woman was already speaking on the phone, describing the situation as if it were a serious security breach. Ricardo backed toward the door, his legs trembling not just from weakness, but from a complex mixture of anger, sadness, and disbelief. "Thank you for your kindness," he said with bitter irony. "I hope you never need the compassion you denied today." Leaving the break room, Ricardo felt the first sharp stab of pain in his chest since he had woken up in the bathroom. It was different from the previous pain, sharper, as if someone was sticking needles directly into his heart. He leaned against the corridor wall, hand pressed against his chest, trying to breathe through the pain while sweat began to trickle down his forehead. He looked at his watch again. Only 10 hours remained now, and his body was clearly accelerating the deterioration process. Each irregular beat of his heart was a reminder that time was rapidly running out, and he still hadn't found a single person in his company who demonstrated genuine compassion. Perhaps this is what I deserve, he thought bitterly, to build an empire of indifference and die a victim of it. A group of young executives passed him in the hallway, all wearing expensive suits and animatedly discussing a party they had organized with the corporate card. None of them noticed Ricardo leaning against the wall, struggling to breathe, or if they noticed, they chose to ignore him. He recognized one of them as someone he had recently promoted, a talented young man who had impressed in a presentation. Now that same young man laughed while telling how he had inflated expenses from a business trip to finance a personal weekend. The others congratulated him on his cleverness, sharing their own stories of how they exploited loopholes in the system. I created these monsters, Ricardo realized with horror, gave them power without teaching responsibility, money without teaching humanity. The chest pain was progressively worsening, now radiating to his left arm and jaw, classic signs he recognized even without being a doctor. He needed to find somewhere to sit before he fell again, but all the spaces on the ground floor seemed to have invisible guardians ready to expel anyone who didn't belong. He saw a small waiting area near the service elevators, just a few simple metal benches that the maintenance staff used during breaks. It wasn't comfortable, but at least perhaps no one would expel him from there. He dragged himself to the nearest bench and practically collapsed onto it, the cold metal providing minimal relief against the feverish heat taking over his body. I just need a few minutes, he muttered to himself, just a few minutes to regain my strength. Sitting there, observing the constant movement of people entering and exiting the elevators, Ricardo had a clear vision of the real functioning of his company. He saw employees arriving late and punching in for colleagues, supervisors morally harassing subordinates with cruel smiles, the cleaning staff being treated as invisible while they worked tirelessly. A cleaning woman passed by pushing a heavy cart of cleaning products, and when she nodded greeting some executives, they simply ignored her as if she were part of the furniture. The woman continued her work without showing hurt, accustomed to invisibility, but Ricardo could see the weariness in her eyes, the weight of years being treated as less than human. How many people like her exist here? He wondered. How many good, hard-working people that I never bothered to know? The clock in the lobby marked the relentless passage of time, each minute taking away a piece of his limited life. Ricardo tried to stand up from the metal bench, but his legs seemed to have turned to jelly, unable to support his weight. The pain in his chest had transformed into a constant pressure, as if someone had placed an anvil on his thorax. He knew he should seek medical help, that he should give up this insane mission and spend his last hours in a hospital bed, but something drove him to continue. He needed to find at least one good person in that place, someone who justified the years of work, someone who deserved to inherit what he had built. They can't have all been in vain, he said aloud, not caring if anyone heard. There has to be someone decent here. With superhuman effort, he managed to stand again, using the wall as support, as he began to walk along the main corridor of the ground floor. Each step was a battle, each breath a conscious effort, but he kept moving, determined to complete his investigation. He passed by the customer service area and saw employees being rude to elderly clients, rushing them and treating their questions with impatience. He passed by the sales department and heard conversations about how to deceive customers into buying unnecessarily expensive products. Each discovery was like a stab in his already fragile heart, the realization that he had built not a company, but a machine that ground up humanity. "My God, what have I done?" he lamented, his voice choked with tears he could no longer contain. A young intern accidentally bumped into him while running with a stack of documents, dropping some papers on the floor. Instead of apologizing, she looked at him with irritation and demanded that he help her pick up the documents she had dropped. Ricardo, even with the excruciating pain and difficulty bending down, began to help her. But when his trembling hand dropped one of the papers again, she exploded in frustration. "Forget it, useless old man. You're making things worse rather than helping," she shouted, snatching the papers from his hands and hurrying away. Ricardo stood there, watching her disappear into one of the offices, and wondered when youth had become synonymous with cruelty in his company. They learned the wrong lessons too well, he reflected with regret. Efficiency without empathy, success without soul. The corridor began to spin around him, and Ricardo realized he was about to faint again. He desperately looked for something to support himself, but he was in the middle of the main corridor, far from any wall or furniture. His legs gave way as if his bones had turned to water, and he fell to his knees on the polished floor, his hands splayed out, trying to prevent himself from falling completely. He could hear people passing around him, the clicks of high heels on the floor, conversations that continued as if he weren't there, agonizing in the middle of the path. Someone even complained aloud that he was blocking the way and had to step around him as if he were an inconvenient obstacle. "Help," he tried to say, but his voice came out as an inaudible whisper. "Someone, please." The pain had now spread throughout his body, every cell seeming to scream in agony. Ricardo could hear his own heart beating erratically, sometimes too fast, sometimes almost stopping like a broken machine trying to function with the last drops of fuel. His vision was becoming increasingly dark, tunnels of shadow closing in from the edges, and he knew that this time he might not wake up. He tried to raise his head to see if anyone at all would show a minimum of concern, but all he saw were shoes passing by hurriedly, each pair representing someone who chose not to get involved. "So this is how it ends," he thought with resignation. "I'll die as I lived, surrounded by people but completely alone." 2 security guards finally appeared, not to help, but to assess whether he posed a threat. They talked among themselves about protocols and legal responsibilities, debating whether they should remove him or wait for him to stop moving on his own. One of them suggested calling an ambulance, but the other reminded him that this could create image problems for the company if the media found out. While they discussed bureaucracies, Ricardo felt life slipping from his body like sand between fingers. Each second of their hesitation was 1 second less of his existence, but they seemed more concerned with paperwork than with the human being dying at their feet. Until the end, he thought with bitter irony, policies are more important than people. The clock in the lobby showed that only 8 hours of life remained according to the doctor's prediction, but Ricardo doubted he would last that long. His body was giving up rapidly, each system failing in sequence like falling dominoes. He could feel his kidneys shutting down, his liver collapsing, his lungs struggling to process the little air he managed to draw in. It was a symphony of organ failure, and he was both the conductor and the audience of this macabre concert. He tried once more to ask for help, but all that came out was a weak moan that got lost in the murmur of the hallway. "Please," his mind screamed while his voice failed, "someone see me as human just once." A maintenance worker passed by, pushing a cart of tools, and almost tripped over Ricardo. Instead of being concerned about the fallen man, he grumbled about people cluttering the hallway and continued on his way, the metallic noise of the tools echoing as he moved away. Ricardo watched the cart disappear in the distance and thought about all the times he himself had gone through similar situations, too busy and important to notice others suffering. Guilt now weighed more than the physical pain, the understanding that he had been the architect of his own final solitude. "I reaped exactly what I sowed," he admitted to himself, indifference generating indifference in an endless cycle. His vision was almost completely dark now, only small points of light dancing like distant stars. He could hear voices, but they seemed to come from very far away, echoes in an infinite tunnel. Someone was saying something about calling the janitor to clean the area, as if he were dirt to be swept away. Another suggested placing isolation cones around him so people wouldn't trip. The dehumanization was complete. He had ceased to be a person and become a logistical problem to be solved. Ricardo wanted to laugh at the absurd tragedy of it all, but he no longer had the strength even for that. From CEO to rubble in just a few hours, he thought with morbid fascination, must be some kind of record. The cold was taking over his body now, starting from the extremities and moving toward the center like a relentless icy tide slowly rising. It was a cold different from the building's air conditioning, a cold that came from within, the cold of death approaching with silent but determined steps. Ricardo had read about this somewhere, perhaps in one of those medical articles he used to browse in waiting rooms, about how the body diverts blood from the extremities to try to keep vital organs functioning as long as possible. It was fascinating and terrifying at the same time to experience firsthand what he had read about so clinically and distantly, to feel his body executing emergency protocols that millions of years of evolution had programmed, a desperate and automatic attempt to preserve the brain and heart even if it meant sacrificing everything else. It was his organism's last effort to keep him alive, a lost battle that his body fought out of pure instinct, without consulting his conscious mind, without asking permission, just fighting with the blind determination of billions of cells that didn't want to cease existing. He tried to move his fingers, but they no longer responded, as if they belonged to someone else, as if they were wax appendages attached to his arms by some cruel sculptor. First it was his toes, then his fingers. Now he felt the cold climbing up his arms and legs like icy snakes crawling under his skin, each conquered centimeter being another piece of him that ceased to exist functionally. "I'm saying goodbye to myself, piece by piece," he reflected with strange calmness, watching my own body abandon me in slow motion, a cellular desertion from which I cannot desert. Josephine Wilson was the type of woman who went unnoticed in corporate hallways, her 52 years marked by wrinkles that told stories of laughter and tears in equal measure. Short and plump, with grey hair always tied in a practical bun, she wore the blue uniform of the cleaning company with the dignity of someone who understands that all honest work has value. Her hands, calloused from years of chemical products and hard work, were surprisingly gentle when necessary, and her brown eyes carried a kindness that 15 years of cleaning luxurious offices had not managed to erase. That afternoon, she pushed her cleaning cart through the main lobby, as she had done every day for more than a decade, invisible to the executives who hurried past. She was humming softly an old lullaby she used to sing to her grandchildren when something caught her attention. A man lying in the middle of the hallway, surrounded by people who were filming but not helping. "My God in heaven, what's happening here?" she exclaimed, immediately dropping the cart and running toward the fallen man. Josephine made her way through the onlookers with a determination that surprised everyone, her small figure suddenly seeming much larger as she pushed aside the people blocking her path. She knelt beside Ricardo without hesitation, her knees protesting against the hard floor, but she ignored the pain while quickly checking his vital signs. Years ago, before becoming a cleaner, she had taken a first aid course when she dreamed of becoming a nurse, a dream that life had postponed but not completely erased. She placed 2 fingers on his neck, feeling a weak and irregular pulse, then brought her ear close to his mouth to check his breathing. What she found alarmed her deeply. The man was in critical condition, probably having a heart attack, and no one had done absolutely anything to help. "For the love of God, someone call an ambulance now," she shouted, looking around in disbelief. "This man is dying and you're all standing there filming?" One of the security guards approached, not to help, but to question Josephine's authority to give orders. He was young, probably new to the job, and clearly more concerned with protocols than with the human life ebbing away on the floor. Josephine had no patience for his bureaucratic objections, turning her attention fully to Ricardo while taking her own water bottle from her uniform pocket. It was lukewarm water she had filled at home in the morning, kept to drink during her shift, but now it had a much more important purpose. She poured some on her apron, creating an improvised compress that she gently placed on Ricardo's feverish forehead. The rough fabric of the uniform wasn't ideal, but it was better than nothing, and she worked with what she had available. "Sir, can you hear me?" she asked softly, holding his hand between hers. "Squeeze my hand if you can understand me, please." Ricardo felt the warm and rough touch of Josephine's hands, like an anchor in the middle of the ocean of pain in which he was drowning. He managed to weakly squeeze her fingers, an almost imperceptible movement, but one that Josephine immediately felt. She smiled, a smile that lit up her tired face, and squeezed his hand back with comforting firmness. Her eyes filled with tears seeing his condition, blue lips, shallow breathing, cold sweat covering his pale face. It was clear that he was struggling to remain conscious, fighting not to let the darkness win. Josephine had seen death before, had held her husband's hand when he passed away 5 years ago, and recognized the signs. But this time, she wouldn't let it happen, not if she could prevent it. "I won't leave you alone. Do you hear me?" Kalshi said in a firm but gentle voice. "Everything will be all right. I promise everything will be all right." The cleaning department supervisor appeared among the crowd, his face red with irritation at seeing Josephine kneeling on the floor instead of working. He was a middle-aged man with a prominent belly and an unkempt mustache, known for his rigidity with schedules and his lack of compassion for employees. He started yelling before even fully understanding the situation, his voice echoing through the lobby and attracting even more attention. Josephine didn't even turn to face him, keeping all her attention on Ricardo, constantly checking his pulse and trying to keep him conscious. She wet the compress again with the rest of the water, cleaning the sweat from his face with gentle maternal movements. "Josephine, get back to work immediately," ordered the supervisor, his voice loaded with authority. "This is not our business. Let security handle it." "I won't leave a human being to die on the floor while everyone stands watching," replied Josephine without taking her eyes off Ricardo, her voice calm but determined. She adjusted his head on her lap, providing a bit more comfort than the cold floor could offer. She could feel his body shaking, probably from shock, and wished she had a blanket or something to warm him. She looked around seeking help, but people had formed a circle of morbid curiosity, all keeping a safe distance while watching the drama unfold. Some continued filming, others whispered among themselves, speculating about what had happened, but nobody offered practical assistance. Josephine felt a wave of anger mixed with sadness. When had humanity become a spectacle to be consumed instead of a shared responsibility? "Does anyone have a coat I could borrow?" she asked the crowd. "He's in shock. He needs to warm up." No one moved to help, all of them looking away when Josephine stared at them directly, like children caught doing something wrong, but without the courage to admit it. An executive even took a step back, holding his expensive suit jacket more tightly, as if afraid she might take it by force. Josephine shook her head in disgust, but didn't waste time with recriminations. She took off her own thin coat that she wore over her uniform, an old and worn piece she had bought at a thrift store, but which still retained some warmth. She covered Ricardo's torso with it, trying to preserve whatever body heat he still had. The man on the floor opened his eyes for a moment, tears running down the sides as he looked at her, with a mixture of gratitude and despair. "Thank you," he managed to whisper, the word almost inaudible, but Josephine heard it and her heart tightened. "No need to thank me, sir. Any decent person would do the same," replied Josephine, although they both knew this was clearly not true considering the dozens of people who had passed by him without helping. She continued talking, maintaining a soft and comforting monologue, trying to keep him awake and conscious. She told him about her grandchildren, about how the youngest had learned to walk last week, about how the oldest was doing well in school despite all the difficulties. It was trivial, everyday conversation, but it served an important purpose. Maintaining human connection, giving him something to focus on besides the pain. Ricardo listened to every word as if it were the most important thing in the world, clinging to the normality of those simple stories like a lifeline in a stormy sea. "You know, you remind me of my late husband," Josephine said softly. "He was stubborn too, fought till the end, never gave up on anything." The supervisor had taken out his cell phone and was calling someone, probably upper management, complaining about Josephine's insubordination and the circus she was creating in the main lobby. Josephine could hear fragments of the conversation, words like dismissal, bad example, and disruption of order floating up to her. She knew she was putting her job at risk, the only job she had, which supported her and her 3 orphaned grandchildren. But looking at Ricardo's pale face, at his eyes silently begging not to be abandoned, she knew she had no choice. There were things more important than money, more important than financial security. Human dignity, compassion, the simple act of not letting someone die alone, these things were priceless. "I know what it's like to be at rock bottom, sir," she told Ricardo, gently stroking his forehead. "When my husband died, I thought I couldn't go on, but we always find strength when we need it." Ricardo was struggling to keep his eyes open, each eyelid weighing a ton, but Josephine's voice kept him anchored to consciousness. She had a soft accent from the countryside, rounded and warm words that reminded him of home, family, things he had never really had. He tried to speak again, wanted to tell her who he was, wanted her to know that her kindness would not be forgotten, but his voice wouldn't cooperate. He could only weakly squeeze her hand in response to her words, hoping she would understand how much that gesture meant. Josephine seemed to understand because she smiled again, that maternal smile that had probably comforted her grandchildren on countless nightmare nights. "Don't strain yourself to speak," she gently instructed. "Save your strength. You'll need it." The clock in the lobby marked the relentless passage of time, and Josephine made a quick calculation. It had been almost 20 minutes since she had found the fallen man, and still no ambulance had arrived. She suspected that no one had actually called emergency services, all too concerned with responsibilities and protocols to do the right thing. She took out her own old cell phone, a device that barely worked and that she used only for emergencies, and dialed the emergency number herself. While waiting for someone to answer, she continued monitoring Ricardo's vital signs, noting with concern that his pulse was becoming weaker and irregular. When they finally answered, she was clear and direct, giving the exact address and describing the symptoms with the precision of someone who had learned the importance of every second in critical situations. "Please come quickly," she begged the attendant. "I think he's having a heart attack and I don't know how much longer he can hold on." The supervisor had approached again, this time accompanied by 2 security guards, and Josephine knew her situation was about to get significantly worse. She recognized one of the guards as the same one who had ignored Ricardo earlier, and the irony of the situation didn't go unnoticed. Now they were ready to act, not to help the dying man, but to remove the only person who was trying to save him. The supervisor stopped right beside her, his shadow falling over Ricardo like a bad omen. Josephine could feel the anger emanating from him, the kind of petty anger from someone whose authority had been publicly challenged. "Josephine, this is the last time I'm going to ask politely," he said, his voice low and threatening. "Stand up now and get back to work, or consider yourself fired." "Then fire me," Josephine responded without hesitation, not even looking at him, all her attention still focused on Ricardo. "I'd rather lose my job than lose my humanity," she continued, her voice firm despite the tears that were beginning to form in her eyes. She knew what this decision meant. Without the salary, she couldn't pay rent, couldn't buy food for her grandchildren, couldn't pay for their school supplies. But looking at the man in her arms, seeing the silent gratitude in his eyes, she knew she had made the right decision. Some values couldn't be negotiated, some lines couldn't be crossed. If the price of keeping her job was abandoning someone to die alone, then it was too high a price to pay. "Go ahead, fire me," she repeated, now looking directly at the supervisor, "but I will not abandon this man." The supervisor turned red with anger, his face contorting into an expression of fury that Josephine had seen before in men who weren't used to being contradicted. He started shouting, words about insubordination, about setting a bad example, about the consequences of her actions. Josephine let the words pass through her like water, not letting them reach her. She had learned long ago that some people shouted because they had nothing else to offer, used volume where substance was lacking. She turned her attention back to Ricardo, noticing that he was trying to say something, his lips moving without producing sound. She brought her ear close to his mouth, trying to catch any whisper he could produce. "I told you my name was Hudson Wright, but don't let her lose her job," he managed to articulate with supreme effort, and Josephine understood he was trying to defend her. "Shh, don't worry about me," Josephine said gently, touching his face with maternal affection. "I've been through worse and survived. I'll survive this too," she assured him, although the uncertainty of the future weighed on her heart. She had lost her husband to cancer 5 years ago, had lost her daughter in a car accident 2 years later, leaving her with 3 grandchildren to raise alone. There were nights when she didn't know how she would put food on the table the next day, mornings when she woke up wondering how she would continue. But she had always found a way. A solution had always appeared, even if at the last second. Maybe it was faith, Maybe it was luck, or maybe it was just the stubbornness of not giving up. "You know, sir," she said to Ricardo, "when my daughter died and left me with 3 small children, I thought the world had ended." Ricardo listened to every word as if it were a sacred sermon, finding in Josephine's simple story a strength he didn't know he needed. This woman, who had clearly suffered more than he ever would, still maintained enough kindness to stop everything and help a stranger. She had lost more than he had ever had, and yet she seemed richer in spirit than he had ever been. Tears were flowing freely down his face now, not from pain or fear, but from a deep understanding of how wrongly he had lived his life. All the money in the world couldn't buy the kind of wealth that Josephine possessed, the wealth of compassion, empathy, unconditional love for others. "You are an angel," he managed to whisper, each word costing him a tremendous effort. "I'm no angel, I'm just a person who still remembers how to be human," Josephine replied, carefully wiping away his tears. The supervisor had called for more reinforcements now, and Josephine could see from the corner of her eye that the situation was escalating. More security guards had arrived, forming a semicircle around them, clearly preparing to remove her by force if necessary. She knew she couldn't physically resist if they decided to drag her away, but she also knew that doing so in front of so many witnesses would be terrible for the company's image. Some people had stopped filming the fallen man and started filming the confrontation between her and management, and Josephine hoped this would give her a few more precious minutes. "Look at yourselves," she said loudly for everyone to hear, more concerned with removing those who help than helping those in need. A murmur ran through the crowd, some people finally beginning to question the situation. Josephine heard someone comment that what they were doing was inhumane, another asking why the ambulance hadn't arrived yet. Small cracks were beginning to appear in the wall of indifference, consciences being prodded by the sight of a humble woman risking everything to help a stranger. But the supervisor wasn't interested in public opinion at that moment. His authority had been challenged, and he needed to reassert it. He signaled for the security guards to approach, and Josephine felt her heart race. Not out of fear for herself, but for Ricardo. If they removed her now, who would take care of him? Who would hold his hand as life slipped from his body? "Please at least wait for the ambulance to arrive," she begged. "Then I'll leave without resistance, I promise." "You leave now or you'll be forcibly removed and prosecuted for trespassing and disturbance," threatened the supervisor, clearly beyond the point of negotiation. Josephine looked at Ricardo, saw the panic in his eyes at the possibility of being abandoned again, and made her decision. If they were going to remove her, they would have to do it physically, and she wouldn't make things easy. She squeezed Ricardo's hand tighter, conveying through touch the promise that she wouldn't abandon him voluntarily. He responded by squeezing back, a weak grip but full of meaning. It was a silent pact between two strangers, united by extraordinary circumstances. She wouldn't let him die alone, no matter the cost. "Gentlemen," she said to the approaching security guards, "are you really going to tear away a woman who is trying to save a life?" The security guards hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with the situation. They were paid to maintain order, not to participate in complex moral dramas. One of them, younger, even took a step back, clearly not wanting to be part of it. But the other, older and probably more accustomed to following orders without questioning, continued approaching. Josephine could see the resignation in his eyes, the kind of resignation of someone who had given up thinking for himself long ago. When he reached out to grab her, Josephine leaned protectively over Ricardo, using her body as a shield. "Not until the ambulance arrives," she repeated firmly. "You can drag me away after that, but not before." It was at that moment that the sound of sirens finally cut through the air, distant but rapidly approaching. Josephine felt a wave of relief so strong it almost knocked her over. The cavalry was coming. Real help was on the way. She looked at Ricardo and smiled, a genuine smile of hope. The paramedics could stabilize him, take him to the hospital, give him a real chance to survive. But her relief was short-lived when she realized the supervisor wasn't backing down. On the contrary, he seemed even more determined to remove her before the ambulance arrived, probably so he could say he had maintained order and discipline. "The ambulance is coming," Josephine said desperately. "Just a few more minutes, please." "I had your chance, Josephine. Now face the consequences, the supervisor responded coldly. He motioned for the security guards to proceed, and Josephine felt strong hands grabbing her arms, trying to lift her up. She resisted with all the strength she had, not violently, but making herself dead weight, making their task as difficult as possible. Ricardo tried to protest, tried to speak, but only a weak moan came from his throat. His eyes, however, spoke volumes. Desperation, gratitude, anger, all mixed in a look Josephine would never forget. "I'll be back," she promised him as she was dragged away. "As soon as I can, I'll be back. Hang in there." The supervisor took the opportunity to make his power speech, his voice echoing through the lobby for everyone to hear clearly. "Josephine Wilson, you are officially terminated for abandoning your post in subordination and creating a disturbance in the workplace. Turn in your badge immediately and collect your personal belongings. You have 10 minutes to leave the building or I'll call the police," he announced, clearly satisfied with his display of authority. Josephine felt the words like physical blows, fired, jobless, with no way to support her grandchildren. The reality of what had just happened began to sink in, the weight of the consequences of her compassionate choice. "Please, sir," she tried one last time, tears running down her face. "I need this job. I have 3 grandchildren to raise." "You should have thought about that before disobeying direct orders," the supervisor replied, without a hint of compassion. Josephine removed her badge with trembling hands, the small plastic card that represented her survival, and handed it over. 15 years of dedicated work, of arriving early and leaving late, of cleaning up messes that others wouldn't touch, all summed up in a moment of moral choice. But looking back, seeing Ricardo still lying on the floor, now alone again as the paramedics approached running with the stretcher, she knew she had made the right choice. "Can I at least stay until he's taken away?" she asked, her voice breaking with emotion. "You have 10 minutes to leave or I'll call the police," went the supervisor repeated mechanically, already turning his back on her. The paramedics had finally arrived, efficient professionals who immediately began working on Ricardo, checking vital signs, applying oxygen, preparing him for transport. Josephine watched from afar, prevented by security guards from approaching again, her heart torn between relief that he was receiving help and despair over her own situation. One of the paramedics asked if anyone knew the patient's name or what had happened, and Josephine shouted over the security guards. "His name is Hudson Wright. He collapsed about 30 minutes ago. Possible heart attack." Ricardo, even in his semi-conscious state, watched helplessly as Josephine cried, devastated by the dismissal she had just received. The supervisor was relentless, moving even closer with the security guards at his side, his face contorted in an expression of cruel satisfaction. "You have 30 seconds to hand over your badge and leave, Josephine, or I'll have the guards drag you out," he threatened, looking at his watch as if timing each second. Josephine was still holding Ricardo's hand, her fingers trembling while tears streamed down her tired face, torn between abandoning him and facing the even worse consequences of resisting. "Please," she whispered to Ricardo, squeezing his hand one last time. "Forgive me for having to leave you." Ricardo tried with all the strength he had left to speak, to defend Josephine, to tell everyone who he really was to save her job, but his voice simply wouldn't come out. Only a weak guttural sound escaped his throat as he watched Josephine being forced to let go of his hand by the approaching security guards. The supervisor continued his torrent of threats, now pulling out his cell phone and pretending to dial the police. "I'll file a report for disturbing the peace and trespassing on private property," he said cruelly. "Besides being fired, you'll leave here with a criminal record if you don't obey now." Josephine looked at Ricardo in despair, her eyes begging forgiveness for having to abandon him, as she removed her badge with trembling hands. The distant sound of sirens began to echo, but it still seemed very far away, lost in the noise of city traffic, and the supervisor took the opportunity to intensify his threats. He positioned himself between Josephine and Ricardo, blocking even visual contact between them, his bulky body creating a physical and symbolic barrier. "The ambulance will still take at least 10 minutes to arrive in this traffic," he said coldly, consulting his expensive watch with a theatrical gesture. "More than enough time for the police to arrive first and take you away for disturbing the peace, trespassing, and disobedience." He was already dialing numbers on his cell phone, each touch on the screen like a nail being hammered into the coffin of Josephine's hopes. "Hello, police. Yes, we have a situation here at Taylor Construction. A former employee is refusing to leave the premises and is causing a disturbance," he began to speak, his voice laden with false concern for safety. Josephine was sobbing now, completely destroyed, her body trembling as the reality of her situation hit her like successive waves of despair. Without the job, she would have no way to feed her grandchildren, the children who depended on her for everything since they had lost their parents. The rent was due in a week, the pantry was almost empty, the electricity bill was already late. She had calculated every cent of the salary she would receive at the end of the month, a salary that would now never come. The tears flowed freely down her face as she looked at her calloused hands, hands that had cleaned those offices for 15 years, that had worked honestly every day, and that now trembled in the face of brutal injustice. "My grandchildren," she sobbed. "How will I explain to my grandchildren that Grandma chose to help a stranger instead of securing their bread?" Ricardo felt each of her sobs like a knife in his already aching chest, each of her tears burning more than the physical pain devastating his body. His complete powerlessness in the face of the cruelty he himself had allowed to flourish in his company was a torture worse than impending death. This kind woman was being destroyed for trying to save him, and he could do nothing but watch. The supervisor remained on the phone, exaggerating the situation, inventing threats that didn't exist, painting Josephine as a dangerous troublemaker when all she had done was demonstrate basic humanity. The other employees watched in cowardly silence, some even nodding when the supervisor looked at them, validating his cruelty out of fear of being next. "Don't. Let..." Ricardo tried to whisper once more, but his voice was inaudible amid the commotion, lost like a whisper in the middle of a hurricane. The lobby of Taylor Construction had transformed into an arena of cruelty, with dozens of employees forming a circle around the unfolding drama. Ricardo, still lying on the cold floor, felt every muscle in his body protest as he tried to gather strength for what he needed to do. Josephine continued crying, her badge already in the hands of the supervisor, who held it like a trophy of his unquestionable authority. The ambulance siren still sounded distant, stuck somewhere in the chaotic city traffic, and each passing second was one less second in Ricardo's life. With a determination that came from somewhere beyond physical pain, he began to move his arms, pressing his palms against the cold floor. "I need to. Get up," he muttered to himself. "I need to do this for her." The effort to raise his trunk was monumental, each inch gained sending waves of agony through his compromised chest. Several people in the crowd stepped back, as if the unexpected movement of a man who seemed to be dying was something supernatural or dangerous. The supervisor, still holding the phone and talking to the police, paused his conversation to observe with a mixture of irritation and curiosity. Josephine, through her tears, was the first to notice what Ricardo was trying to do, and instinctively moved to help him, but was blocked by the security guards. Ricardo finally managed to sit up, his body dangerously swaying, but remaining upright through sheer willpower. "Please," he managed to say, his voice hoarse but surprisingly audible in the tense silence. "A moment. Just a moment." The supervisor lowered the phone, clearly irritated by the interruption of his power display, and approached Ricardo with heavy steps that echoed on the marble floor. His face was contorted in an expression of disdain, as if Ricardo's mere attempt to speak was a personal affront to his authority. Ricardo, with trembling hands that barely obeyed his commands, began searching for something in the inner pocket of his pants. The movement was slow and painful, each second seeming like an eternity as everyone watched in tense silence. Finally, his fingers found what they were looking for, a heavy gold pen, clearly expensive, with the initials RM engraved in elegant calligraphy. "Sir," Ricardo said, looking directly at the supervisor, "do you recognize this pen?" The supervisor looked at the object with a mixture of confusion and growing irritation, clearly not understanding where this was leading. The gold Mont Blanc pen gleamed under the fluorescent lights of the lobby, an object clearly beyond the financial reach of an ordinary unemployed person. Ricardo then, with even more difficulty, pulled out a crumpled and dirty but still legible business card. It was a special card, the kind only the company's senior management possessed, with the embossed gold crest of Taylor Construction. The supervisor grabbed the card roughly, examined it for a few seconds, and then began to laugh, a harsh and cruel sound that echoed through the lobby. "Found this in the trash, did you?" he mocked, throwing the card back at Ricardo. "Pathetic. Trying to pass yourself off as someone important with stolen objects." Ricardo was not shaken by the mockery, his determination only strengthening in the face of the final humiliation. With his voice gaining a firmness that was surprising considering his physical state, he looked directly into the supervisor's eyes and began to recite something that made several people in the crowd widen their eyes. It was a sequence of numbers and letters, seemingly random, but spoken with such precision and confidence that it clearly had meaning. 001/95. Initial protocol, first invoice of Taylor Construction, issued 30 years ago, Ricardo said slowly, each word clear despite the pain. "This is a code that only the founder of the company knows," he continued. "Call the legal department now and ask for confirmation." The supervisor hesitated, his face showing for the first time a shadow of doubt. Some older employees in the crowd had recognized the reference to the initial protocol, something that was almost a legend in the company, the founding document that had started the entire empire. A murmur began to spread through the crowd, people whispering among themselves, trying to understand what was happening. The supervisor, realizing he was losing control of the situation, tried to regain his authority with aggression. "This is ridiculous. Anyone could have memorized these numbers," he shouted. But his voice had lost some of its previous conviction. "Call legal," Ricardo insisted, each word costing him visible effort. "Ask about the founder's safe, about the original document." An administrative employee, who had been watching everything in silence, suddenly spoke up, her voice cutting through the tension. She had worked in legal years ago and knew the company's security protocols. "That code," she said loud enough for everyone to hear. "I've heard of it. It's impossible for an outsider to know it." The supervisor turned to her with fury, but before he could reprimand her, others began to agree, longtime employees who had heard stories about the company's early days. Doubt was spreading like wildfire, and the supervisor realized he needed to act quickly to maintain control. "Fine," he finally said, picking up the phone. "I'll call legal and put an end to this nonsense once and for all." While the supervisor dialed the legal department's number, Ricardo turned his attention to Josephine, who was observing everything with a mixture of confusion and hope. Their eyes met across the small distance separating them, and he tried to convey with his gaze a silent message that everything would be all right, that she hadn't lost her job in vain. Josephine, even without fully understanding what was happening, felt something change in the air, an electrical tension that preceded great revelations. The supervisor was talking on the phone now, his voice initially authoritative, then gradually more hesitant. "Yes, I need to verify a security code," he said, casting an irritated glance at Ricardo. "A man here is claiming to know the company's initial protocol." The silence in the lobby was absolute now, all eyes alternating between the supervisor on the phone and Ricardo, his breathing laborious, but his eyes determined. The supervisor repeated the code Ricardo had given, his voice getting lower with each number, as if he feared the words he was pronouncing. There was a long pause, during which the supervisor's face began to change color, going from angry red to a cadaverous white. His hand began to visibly shake, the phone wobbling against his ear. "Are you sure?" he asked in a strangled voice. "Are you absolutely sure?" The answer from the other end of the line must have been definitive, because the supervisor almost dropped the phone. "The head lawyer is coming down," the supervisor announced in a weak voice. All trace of his previous authority evaporated like mist in the sun. "He said not to touch anyone until he arrives," he continued, his gaze now completely avoiding Ricardo. The murmur in the crowd grew to a buzz of speculation, people trying to understand what was happening, some beginning to piece together the puzzle. Josephine stepped forward, taking advantage of the confusion to approach Ricardo again, but the supervisor, even shaken, still maintained enough authoritarian reflexes to block her. "Nobody moves until the doctor arrives," he said, although his voice no longer had any conviction. The following minutes seemed like hours, the entire lobby frozen in a tableau of tension and expectation. Ricardo was struggling to maintain consciousness, his vision becoming blurry at the edges, but he knew he needed to hold on a bit longer. He could hear the executive elevator coming down, the mechanical sound strangely loud in the tense silence. Josephine was crying silently, her tears now mixed with confusion and a cautious hope that perhaps, just perhaps, something extraordinary was about to happen. "Sir," she called softly to Ricardo, "are you all right? Hold on just a little longer." The elevator doors opened with a metallic sound that made several people jump. The company's chief counsel emerged, a 60-year-old man with impeccable white hair and a suit that probably cost more than Josephine earned in a year. He walked quickly through the crowd that parted for him like the Red Sea, his eyes searching until they found Ricardo on the floor. When his gaze settled on the fallen man, his reaction was immediate and dramatic. "My God in heaven!" he exclaimed, rushing the last few meters and kneeling beside Ricardo. "Mr. Taylor, is it really you?" The lobby exploded into chaos. People were shouting, some frantically taking pictures, others backing away in shock. The name Taylor echoed from mouth to mouth like a wave, each repetition loaded with disbelief and horror. The supervisor had literally fallen to his knees, his face now a sickly white, sweat running down his forehead as the magnitude of what he had done hit him like a derailed train. Ricardo Taylor, the founder of the company, the man who signed their paychecks, had been there all along, disguised, dying on the floor while they treated him worse than garbage. "Mr. Taylor," the lawyer repeated, his voice laden with panic. "Where is the ambulance? Has anyone called an ambulance?" Ricardo, with the last strength he still possessed, raised a trembling hand to silence the lawyer. His voice, when it came, was weak, but carried an authority that decades of leadership had forged. He looked around the lobby, his gaze passing over each face in the crowd, faces now marked by fear, shame, belated remorse. Employees who had passed by him without a second glance now trembled under his scrutiny. The supervisor was practically prostrate, babbling incoherent apologies that nobody was listening to. "Doctor," Ricardo said to the lawyer, "I need you to record what I'm about to say now. It's my last will." The lawyer immediately took out his phone, activating the recording while several others did the same, creating multiple witnesses for what was about to happen. Ricardo took a deep breath, the air painfully wheezing in his compromised lungs, and began to speak with surprising clarity. "I, Ricardo Taylor, in full awareness of my mental faculties, declare the following." He paused, his eyes finding Josephine, who was frozen in shock. "I spent my last day of life among you, disguised, wanting to know the true character of the people who work in my company." The crowd was in absolute silence now, each of Ricardo's words falling like hammers on their consciences. He continued, his voice gaining emotional strength, even as his body failed. "I saw greed, I saw cruelty, I saw indifference to human suffering. I saw people I personally helped treat me as less than nothing." His eyes passed over the supervisor, who seemed to want to disappear into the floor. "But I also saw kindness," Ricardo continued, his voice softening. "I saw genuine compassion. I saw someone risk everything to help a stranger." Ricardo extended his hand toward Josephine, who stepped forward, her legs trembling so much she could barely walk. Tears flowed freely down her face as she knelt beside him, taking his outstretched hand in hers. "This woman," Ricardo announced, his voice echoing in the silent lobby, "Josephine Wilson, was the only person who treated me as a human being. She lost her job for helping me without knowing who I was." He paused, breathing with difficulty. "Therefore I declare here before all these witnesses that she will inherit everything." The shock that ran through the lobby was palpable, people gasping, some almost fainting at the revelation. Josephine shook her head frantically, unable to process what she was hearing. "No, Mr. Taylor, I cannot accept," she protested between sobs. "I didn't do this expecting anything. I did it because it was right." Ricardo squeezed her hand with surprising strength, his eyes conveying a desperate urgency. "Exactly because of that," he said with conviction, "because you expected nothing, because you did the right thing when no one else did." The lawyer was frantically typing on his phone, already beginning to legally document the declaration. "Mr. Taylor," he said urgently, "I need more specific details for this to be valid." Ricardo nodded weakly, his voice growing weaker with each word. The entire company, all my accounts, all my investments, all properties, he listed slowly. Everything goes to Josephine Wilson. She has the compassion that this place has lost. Josephine was openly sobbing now, holding Ricardo's hand as if she could anchor him to life through touch. "Sir, please, hang on," she begged. "The ambulance is coming. You're going to be all right." But even as she said the words, she could see that Ricardo was reaching the end. His eyes were losing focus, his breathing becoming more shallow and spaced. He was using his last reserves of energy to ensure that his will would be known and documented. "Please, Mr. Taylor," Josephine cried, "don't do this, don't die." Ricardo managed one last weak smile, his eyes focusing on Josephine one last time. "You taught me something important today," he whispered, his voice almost inaudible now. "You taught me that there is still kindness in this world I built." He looked around the lobby, seeing the remorseful faces, the belated tears, the regret that came too late. "I hope everyone has learned something too," he continued with effort, "that in the end what matters is not the position, not the salary, it's how we treat each other." The supervisor had crawled closer, tears streaming down his face as the magnitude of his actions crushed him. "Mr. Taylor, forgive me," he begged, his voice broken. "I didn't know. I never imagined." Ricardo cut him off with a weak gesture of his hand. "That's exactly the problem," he replied with deep sadness. "You shouldn't need to know who I was to show humanity. Josephine didn't know, and yet she risked everything." The ambulance sirens were very close now, the shrill sound cutting through the drama in the lobby. Ricardo could feel his body beginning to shut down, system by system, like a computer being turned off. His vision was rapidly darkening, the sound around him becoming muffled and distant. But there was something he still needed to say, something crucial. "Josephine," he called urgently, squeezing her hand. "Use this power to do good. Transform this place into something better." Josephine nodded through her tears, understanding the weight of the responsibility that was being placed on her shoulders. "I promise," she said solemnly. "I will honor your trust, Mr. Taylor." Ricardo smiled again, peace finally appearing on his tortured face. "Thank you," he whispered, the words almost lost in the growing chaos around them. "Thank you for reminding me that I am still human." His eyes began to close slowly, like curtains being lowered after the final act of a play. Josephine felt panic rise in her throat as his grip on her hand grew weaker. "No, Mr. Taylor, no!" she screamed, placing his head in her lap again. "Stay with me, please!" The lawyer was shouting for people to make way for the paramedics, but Josephine could barely hear through the roar of blood in her ears. "Someone help!" she begged the crowd. "He's dying." But Ricardo could no longer hear the screams around him. He was floating somewhere between life and death, his consciousness fragmented into pieces of memory and sensation. He could feel Josephine's hands on his face, vaguely heard her voice begging him to stay, but everything seemed to be happening very far away. His heart, which had struggled so much throughout the day, was finally giving in. "So this is how it ends," he thought with strange calmness. "But at least it doesn't end alone." Josephine, realizing that Ricardo had stopped breathing, immediately began performing CPR, her small but strong hands rhythmically pressing on his chest. Years ago, she had taken a first aid course, never imagining she would use that knowledge in such a dramatic situation. 1, 2, 3, 4, she counted aloud, tears falling on Ricardo's pale face. "Come on, come back, it can't end like this." The crowd around had formed a respectful circle, many openly crying now, confronted with the brutal reality of their actions or inactions. The supervisor was on his knees, hands covering his face, sobbing uncontrollably. Other employees were embracing, some praying, all momentarily united by the tragedy they had helped create. "Please, God," Josephine prayed as she continued the compressions, "don't let him go like this. He deserves a second chance." The lawyer was on the phone, coordinating with the hospital, ensuring that the best medical team would be waiting. "Hold on," he shouted, though it wasn't clear whether he was speaking to Josephine or Ricardo. "The ambulance is pulling into the parking lot now." Indeed, the sound of sirens had stopped, replaced by the noise of doors opening and running footsteps. Josephine didn't stop the compressions, determined to keep Ricardo's blood circulating until professional help arrived. "Come back, Ricardo," she begged, using his first name for the first time. "Please, come back." The paramedics burst into the lobby like a force of nature, carrying sophisticated medical equipment. They immediately took control, but Josephine had to be gently pulled away, her hands still making compression movements even in the air. One of the paramedics quickly checked the vital signs, while another prepared the defibrillator. "No pulse, initiating resuscitation protocol," announced the first one, his professional voice cutting through the emotional chaos. "Everyone step back," ordered the second while applying the electrodes to Ricardo's chest. The electric shock made Ricardo's body arch, a grotesque movement that caused several people in the crowd to look away. Josephine watched with her hands interlaced in prayer, every fiber of her being begging for a miracle. The heart monitor continued showing a flat line, the sharp and constant sound like a death sentence. "Increasing the charge," announced the paramedic, preparing for another shock. "Come on, Mr. Taylor," Josephine whispered. "You are strong. You fought all your life. Fight now." The second shock, stronger than the first, shook Ricardo's body again. For a terrible moment, nothing happened. Then, miraculously, a weak beep appeared on the monitor, then another, and another. The rhythm was irregular and weak, but it was life. "We have a pulse," shouted the paramedic, and a collective sigh of relief swept through the lobby. Josephine fell to her knees, sobbing with relief, her prayers transformed into gratitude. "He's coming back," she cried. "He's coming back." The paramedics worked quickly, stabilizing Ricardo, administering medications, preparing him for transport. As they placed him on the stretcher, Josephine approached, ignoring any protocol. "Mr. Taylor," she said softly near his ear, "you did it. Everything will be fine now." There was no response. Ricardo was unconscious, but the monitor showed that his heart continued beating, stubbornly refusing to give up. "We need to go now," urged the chief paramedic. "Every second counts." As they rolled the stretcher toward the ambulance, Josephine made a move to follow them, but was stopped by the lawyer who gently held her arm. "Mrs. Wilson," he said respectfully, though with clear urgency in his voice, "you need to come with me. There are documents to sign, arrangements to be made immediately." Josephine looked between the lawyer and the departing ambulance, torn between a duty she didn't completely understand and the genuine concern she felt for Ricardo. The paramedics were loading the stretcher into the ambulance with practiced efficiency, connecting monitors and preparing medications for the journey. "But he needs someone familiar at the hospital," she protested, pulling her arm toward the ambulance. "Someone who truly cares about him, not just about his money." The lawyer insisted, his tone becoming more urgent as he tried to make her understand the gravity of the legal situation. "Ma'am, you don't understand. There are corporate protocols that need to be followed, shareholders to notify, an entire company that could fall into chaos if we don't act now." Josephine shook her head vigorously, her grey hair coming loose from its bun and falling around her determined face. She had spent her entire life following orders, obeying protocols, putting rules above people, and look where that had gotten all of them. "No," she said firmly, surprising the lawyer with her conviction. "The papers can wait. His life cannot." "Mrs. Wilson, please be reasonable." The lawyer tried again, nervously adjusting his expensive glasses. "Mr. Taylor has the best doctors in the city. There's nothing you can do at the hospital except wait." Josephine turned to face him completely, her tired eyes blazing with determination. Years of submission had broken that day, replaced by a strength she didn't even know she possessed. "Doctor, with all due respect, you don't understand. That man almost died alone today because everyone was too busy with protocols and paperwork. I will not abandon him now to sign documents." The paramedics were closing the ambulance doors, and Josephine broke free from the lawyer, running toward the vehicle with an agility her painful knees hadn't shown in years. "Wait!" she shouted, waving frantically. "Please, wait! I need to go with him." One of the paramedics, a young man with a kind face, paused with his hand on the door. "Ma'am, only family members can accompany," he said apologetically, clearly touched by the emotion in her voice but bound by rules. Josephine felt tears of frustration forming in her eyes. "I am the only family he has," she declared with absolute conviction. "He said so himself. I'm the only one who cared when he needed it most. The lawyer had caught up with Josephine again, his face red from the effort of running with his sedentary body. "Mrs. Wilson, this is highly irregular," he panted, trying to regain his professional composure. "If something happens to you, if there's an accident, the legal implications—" Josephine cut him off with an abrupt gesture of her hand, something she had never in her life done to someone in a position of authority. "Doctor, listen carefully," she said, her voice low but charged with moral authority. "That man chose me to take care of his legacy because I chose to take care of him when no one else did. I will not fail him now because of bureaucracy." The supervisor, who had hesitantly approached the group, tried to intervene, still trying to recover some semblance of control after his humiliation. "Mrs. Josephine," he began, his voice still trembling, "perhaps it's better to follow the lawyer's advice. After all, you now have greater responsibilities." Josephine turned to him with a look that made him step back. It wasn't a look of anger, but of deep disappointment, the kind of look a mother would give to a child who had deeply disappointed her. "Responsibility greater than a human life?" She asked calmly. It was that kind of thinking that created all this tragedy today. The chief paramedic, who had been monitoring Ricardo inside the ambulance, appeared at the door with urgency. "We need to go now," he announced. "The patient is unstable. Every second counts." Josephine didn't hesitate, climbing into the ambulance before anyone could stop her, her knees protesting but her determination unwavering. "I'm going with him," she declared, sitting on the small bench beside the stretcher. "And if anyone has a problem with that, they can sue a retired cleaning lady afterward." The paramedic looked at the lawyer, who sighed in defeat and nodded. "At least give me your phone," the lawyer asked, taking out a business card. "I'll need to contact you as soon as the medical situation stabilizes." Josephine took the card but barely looked at it, all her attention focused on Ricardo, who was pale as wax, tubes and wires connected to his fragile body. She gently took his hand, careful with the IV access, and held it between hers. "You can call the hospital," she said without looking at the lawyer. "I'll be where he is." The ambulance doors closed with a definitive sound, and the vehicle began to move, the sirens starting to sound again as they navigated through traffic. Josephine could hear the lawyer shouting something about powers of attorney and emergency meetings, but his voice was quickly drowned out by the sound of the sirens and the constant beeping of the cardiac monitors. The young paramedic who had allowed her entry adjusted some equipment and then looked at her with curiosity. "Are you really a relative?" he asked gently. "Because he doesn't have anyone listed as an emergency contact in our records." Josephine caressed Ricardo's hand, feeling how cold it was, and responded with simple honesty. "We're family now," she said. "Sometimes the family we choose is stronger than blood." The paramedic nodded, understanding, and returned his attention to the monitors. Josephine observed the numbers and graphs that she didn't fully understand, but could see from the tense expression of the professionals that the situation was critical. "He's strong," she said, both to them and to herself. "He'll make it." As the ambulance raced through the streets, Josephine began to talk to Ricardo, even knowing that he probably couldn't hear her. She told him about how her day had been before finding him, about how she had woken up worried about bills, made weak coffee to save money, hugged her grandchildren before they left for school. She talked about mundane, normal things, the kind of simple life that Ricardo had never experienced. "You know, Mr. Taylor," she said softly, "you gave me a gift today too. You showed me that I still have courage, that I can still make a difference." The heart monitor began to beep irregularly, and the paramedics immediately sprang into action. "He's fibrillating again," one of them announced, preparing medication. Josephine squeezed Ricardo's hand harder, leaning in to speak near his ear. "Don't give up now," she pleaded. "You have a second chance, something few people get. Don't waste it." She could feel tears running down her face again, but she didn't care. "I need you to live," she confessed. "Not for the money or the company, but because you deserve to experience real life, with real connections, with real love." The paramedic administered the medication, and gradually the heart rate stabilized again. Josephine released a sigh of relief that she didn't know she was holding. She looked through the small window of the ambulance and saw the hospital approaching, its emergency sign shining like a beacon of hope. "Almost there," she said to Ricardo. "Hold on just a little longer." She thought of all those in the company lobby, their shocked and remorseful faces, and felt not anger but pity. "They learned a lesson today," she murmured. "I hope they never forget." The ambulance passed through the emergency gates with sirens still wailing, and Josephine felt the vehicle brake abruptly as the hospital's medical team was already waiting outside. The rear doors opened urgently, and experienced hands began transferring Ricardo from the ambulance stretcher to the hospital gurney, shouting medical information that Josephine didn't fully comprehend. She quickly climbed down, almost stumbling in her rush not to lose sight of Ricardo, and followed the medical procession as they ran through the white, sterile corridors. A young doctor with a coffee-stained coat shouted orders while checking Ricardo's vital signs, his face growing progressively darker with each reading. "We need a trauma room now," he ordered, and Josephine had to run to keep up with the frantic pace. "This man is in acute heart failure. Prepare epinephrine and defibrillator." They burst into a room full of intimidating medical equipment, and Josephine was gently but firmly pushed into a corner while the medical team surrounded Ricardo like bees around a hive. Monitors were connected, intravenous lines inserted, medications administered in a practiced choreography of life and death. Josephine watched with her heart in her throat as the numbers on the monitors fluctuated dangerously, each irregular beep sounding like a terrible omen. The lead doctor, whom she could now see better, had deep circles under his eyes and hands that trembled slightly as he worked. "How long since the first episode?" he asked without taking his eyes off Ricardo, and Josephine had to clear her throat before she could answer. "About an hour, doctor, but he received a terminal diagnosis this morning of 24 hours to live." The doctor finally looked at her, his young eyes showing a mixture of surprise and professional skepticism. Josephine could see that he was calculating the odds, weighing the options, and not liking what he found. He approached her while the other doctors continued working on Ricardo, and his expression was somber when he began speaking in a low voice. "Ma'am, I need to be honest with you. His heart is failing rapidly. The cardiac walls are deteriorating at a speed I've never seen before. Any conventional surgical intervention would be fatal. The heart wouldn't withstand the stress of the operation." Josephine felt her legs weaken, but she forced herself to remain standing, clutching the hospital bed rail. "There has to be something you can do," she pleaded, her voice breaking. "He can't die now, not after everything that happened today." It was then that a memory shot through Josephine's mind like lightning, so vivid and painful that she almost lost her breath. 5 years ago, in this same hospital, she had been in a similar situation, holding her husband's hand while doctors explained there was nothing more to be done. But there had been a doctor, a cardiologist named Samuel Fernandez, who had mentioned something about an experimental procedure he was developing. He had said it was revolutionary, something about cardiac regeneration, but that it wasn't ready for human use yet. Her husband had died before they could try anything experimental, but perhaps now, 5 years later. "Doctor!" she suddenly exclaimed, making everyone in the room look at her. "Dr. Samuel Fernandez, he worked here, he was a cardiologist, he had an experimental procedure." The young doctor frowned, clearly recognizing the name but looking confused. He called over an older nurse who was adjusting Ricardo's intravenous drip and asked about Dr. Fernandez. The nurse, a white-haired lady with a kind face, nodded slowly in recognition. "Dr. Fernandez no longer works here," she said with evident regret in her voice. "He left 3 years ago, went to a private research center after—" She paused, looking at Josephine with sudden recognition. "You're Josephine, aren't you?" the nurse asked softly. "I remember you, your husband. It was a very difficult case for Dr. Fernandez." Josephine nodded frantically, tears beginning to form in her eyes with the painful memory. But she pushed them back. There was no time for grief now. "Please, we need to find him," she pleaded, grabbing the nurse's arm. "He's this man's only hope. He mentioned a procedure, something about cardiac regeneration, if he's developed it in the last few years." The nurse exchanged a meaningful look with the young doctor, something passing between them that Josephine couldn't fully decipher. "I've heard rumors," the nurse said cautiously, "that he managed to perfect the procedure, but that it's extremely risky. He's only done it a few times, and not always successfully." The young doctor was clearly skeptical, shaking his head while checking Ricardo's monitors again. The numbers were worsening, the heart struggling more and more to keep the blood circulating. "Even if we could contact Dr. Fernandez," he said reluctantly. "There's no guarantee he would come. He retired from surgical practice after a traumatic case. No one has been able to convince him to return." Josephine wouldn't be discouraged, her determination burning stronger in the face of obstacles. "Please give me his number," she asked. "I'll talk to him. If there's a chance, however small, we need to try." The nurse hesitated for a moment, clearly debating the ethics of sharing personal information, but something in Josephine's controlled desperation convinced her. She went to a computer in the corner of the room and typed quickly, searching through the hospital's old records. After a few tense minutes, she wrote a number on a piece of paper and handed it to Josephine. "This is the number of the research center where he works," she said softly. "But ma'am, don't get your hopes up too high. Dr. Fernandez changed a lot after his last case." Josephine took the paper as if it were made of gold, her hands trembling as she pulled her old cell phone from her pocket. She dialed the number, each ring seeming like an eternity as she waited for someone to answer. Finally, a professional voice answered, identifying the research center. Josephine urgently explained that she needed to speak with Dr. Fernandez, that it was a medical emergency. The receptionist initially resisted, citing policies and schedules, but Josephine wouldn't be dissuaded. "Please," she begged, her voice heavy with raw emotion. "It's a matter of life and death. Tell him Josephine Wilson needs to speak with him about a patient." There was a long pause, during which Josephine could hear muffled voices in the background, and then a different voice came on the line, a voice she recognized immediately, though it sounded older, more tired than she remembered. "Josephine," Dr. Fernandez said, surprise evident in his tone. "Is it really you?" Josephine had to swallow the lump in her throat before responding. Dr. Fernandez had been so kind during her husband's final days, had cried with her when they couldn't save him. "Dr. Fernandez, I need your help," she said quickly. "There's a man here, Ricardo Taylor. He's dying. His heart is failing and the doctors say there's nothing they can do." There was silence on the other end of the line, and Josephine could practically hear the doctor's internal conflict. When he finally spoke, his voice was heavy with reluctance. "Josephine, I don't perform surgeries anymore," he said softly but firmly. "After what happened last time, I swore I would never again." Josephine interrupted him, her desperation overflowing. "Doctor, please, this man, he's different. He spent the whole day learning about humanity, about compassion. He deserves a second chance like my husband deserved but didn't get." "Josephine, you don't understand," Dr. Fernandez responded, his voice growing more agitated. "The procedure I developed, it's extremely risky. I've only performed it 3 times on humans. Only one survived, and even then barely. I can't." Josephine played her last card, knowing it was manipulative but too desperate to care. "You couldn't save my husband," she said, tears streaming down her face now. "But you can save this man. Please, doctor, don't let another person die when there's a chance, however small." The silence that followed was so long that Josephine thought he had hung up. Then she heard a deep, resigned sigh. "Which hospital?" Dr. Fernandez asked, and Josephine nearly collapsed with relief. She quickly gave him the information and he said he would be there in 20 minutes. When Josephine hung up and turned to the young doctor and nurse, she saw expressions of astonishment on their faces. "He's coming," she announced. "Dr. Fernandez is coming." The next 20 minutes were the longest of Josephine's life. The medical team continued trying to stabilize Ricardo, but it was clearly a losing battle. His heart was visibly failing, each beat weaker than the last. Josephine held his hand, whispering words of encouragement, begging him to hold on just a little longer. She told him about Dr. Fernandez, about how brilliant he was, about how there was hope. "You didn't give up on me today," she said firmly. "I won't give up on you now." When Dr. Fernandez finally entered the room, Josephine barely recognized him. He had aged considerably in the last few years, his hair now completely white, deep lines marking his face. But his eyes still had the same intelligent intensity she remembered. He went straight to Ricardo, ignoring the greetings from the other doctors, and began his examination with experienced hands. He checked the monitors, examined the test results, Listen to the heart with a concentration that excluded everything else. "How long since the initial diagnosis?" he asked without looking up, and Josephine answered, "About 20 hours, doctor." Dr. Fernandez finally straightened up, and his face was somber when he turned to face Josephine and the medical team. "The procedure I developed might be his only chance," he said gravely, "but I need everyone to understand the risks. The surgery lasts 8 hours. I'll need to stop the heart completely for several minutes while I inject a regenerative solution directly into the cardiac walls. If we take 1 second too long, there will be irreversible brain death. If the solution doesn't work, he will die on the table." The young doctor immediately protested. "This is madness," he exclaimed. "It's practically a death sentence." "He already has a death sentence," Dr. Fernandez responded calmly. "Without the surgery, he has maybe 2 hours at most. With the surgery, there's a chance, small but real." He turned to Josephine, his eyes serious and compassionate. "As his legal guardian, the decision is yours," he said softly. "But you need to decide now. Every minute that passes diminishes the chances of success." Josephine looked at Ricardo, saw his chest rising and falling with difficulty, saw death approaching inexorably. "If it were you," she asked Dr. Fernandez, "if it were someone you love?" Dr. Fernandez hesitated, and Josephine saw pain cross his face. "If it were someone I love," he finally said, "I would try everything, even knowing the risks, because a small chance is better than no chance at all." Josephine nodded, her decision made. She took the consent form that the young doctor reluctantly offered and signed without hesitation. "Do the surgery," she said firmly. "I trust you, Dr. Fernandez." The preparation for surgery was a whirlwind of organized activity. Ricardo was transferred to the surgical center, and Josephine was authorized to accompany him to the doors of the operating room. Before they took him inside, she leaned down and whispered in his ear, even not knowing if he could hear her. "Be strong, Mr. Taylor," she said. "Fight like you've never fought before. There's a whole world waiting to meet the man you really are, the good man who was hidden behind the walls you built." She gently kissed his forehead, as she would do with her grandchildren. "I'll be here when you wake up." Josephine was directed to the observation gallery, a space with windows that gave a view into the operating room. She sat in the uncomfortable chair, her hands interlaced in prayer, and began the longest vigil of her life. She could see Dr. Fernandez and his team preparing, the precision and care with which they organized each instrument, each medication. The clock on the wall showed that only 4 hours remained of the 24-hour deadline. "Please, God," she prayed silently, "give Dr. Fernandez wisdom and precision, guide his hands." The first hours of the surgery passed in a haze of tension. Josephine watched every movement of Dr. Fernandez, even though she didn't understand most of what was happening. She could see the intense concentration on his face, the meticulous care with which he worked. Occasionally she heard fragments of conversation through the sound system, numbers being called, instruments being requested, medical observations that sounded alien to her untrained ears. "Initiating cardiac arrest protocol," announced Dr. Fernandez at one point, and Josephine held her breath. It was during the 5th hour of surgery that everything began to go wrong. Josephine saw the change in the body language of the medical team before she heard anything. Sudden tension, faster movements, raised voices. The cardiac monitor had begun to show an erratic pattern, and Dr. Fernandez was shouting orders. "He's fibrillating," someone shouted. "We're losing rhythm." Josephine stood up, pressing her hands against the glass, her heart beating so hard she could hear it in her ears. "Not now," she whispered desperately. "Not when we're so close." "Doctor." Fernandez worked with an intensity that bordered on frantic, his hands moving with speed and precision as he tried to save the situation. "I need more time," he shouted to his team. "The solution hasn't had enough time to penetrate." But the monitor showed the cruel truth. Ricardo's heart had completely stopped. The crucial moment had come, the point where they needed to restart the heart after regeneration. "Charging the defibrillator," announced an assistant, and Josephine saw the paddles being positioned on Ricardo's open chest. The first shock didn't work. The monitor continued showing a flat line, that terrible and constant sound that meant death. Josephine was crying now, tears flowing freely down her face as she watched helplessly. "Increasing the charge," Dr. Fernandez announced and tried again. Nothing. The line remained flat, relentless. One of the assistants looked at the clock and began counting the time without brain activity. 3 minutes, 4 minutes. "Come on, Ricardo," Josephine shouted, not caring if anyone could hear her. "Fight! You promised you would fight." Dr. Fernandez tried a third time, the maximum charge they could use without causing more damage. Josephine fell to her knees, her hands still pressed against the glass, praying with every fiber of her being. "Please," she begged any force that might be listening. "He deserves to live. He learned his lesson, he changed. Please, give him the chance to make a difference." The silence in the operating room was deafening, everyone looking at the monitor, waiting, hoping for a miracle. Then, when they were about to declare brain death, when Dr. Fernandez was lowering the defibrillator paddles in defeat, it happened. A weak beep, then another, and another. Ricardo's heart had started beating again, irregular, weak, but beating. The room exploded into renewed activity, everyone working to stabilize the precarious rhythm. Josephine sobbed with relief, her prayers turning into thanks. "Thank you," she whispered repeatedly. "Thank you, thank you, thank you." The last 3 hours of surgery passed in a blur. Dr. Fernandez worked methodically to ensure that the regeneration was complete, that the heart could sustain Ricardo on its own. Josephine didn't leave her post in the gallery, even when her legs protested, even when her bladder begged for relief. She wouldn't leave Ricardo alone, not after everything they had been through. Finally, after 8 hours and 17 minutes, Dr. Fernandez stepped back and announced, "It's done. Now it's up to him." Ricardo was transferred to the intensive care unit, still unconscious but stable. Josephine was authorized to stay by his side, and she pulled a chair close to the bed, taking his hand carefully between hers. The clock on the wall showed the passing hours. It was already early morning of the next day, well beyond the fatal deadline the doctor had given. Josephine observed Ricardo's face, looking for any sign of consciousness. He had survived the impossible, exceeded all medical predictions. "You did it," she whispered, gently caressing his hand. "You proved that miracles happen. Now you need to wake up and truly live." Josephine maintained her vigil in silence, watching the regular rise and fall of Ricardo's chest, the constant beeps of the monitors confirming he was alive and stable. Exhaustion weighed on her like a lead blanket, but she refused to sleep, refused to leave him alone after everything they had been through together. When the first rays of sunlight began to enter through the hospital window, something extraordinary happened. Ricardo's eyes opened slowly, gradually focusing on Josephine's face. For a moment, they just looked at each other, communicating without words everything that had happened. "You saved my life twice in the same day," Ricardo whispered, his voice hoarse but clear. Josephine smiled through her tears, gently squeezing his hand. She thought about everything they had been through, the collapse in the lobby, the humiliation and abandonment, the dramatic revelation, the race against time, the impossible surgery. Each moment had been a battle, each second a victory hard won. "Actually, it was 3 times, she corrected softly, her smile widening. "I didn't let you give up when it mattered most." Ricardo tried to move, but he was still too weak. His eyes, however, were alive in a way that Josephine had never seen before. There was hope in them, gratitude, and something deeper. "How can I thank you?" he asked, tears beginning to form. "How can I repay what you've done?" Josephine gently shook her head. She didn't need thanks, didn't need repayment. What she had done because it was right, because it was human. "Live, Mr. Taylor," she said simply. "Live each day as if it were a gift, because now you know it is." Dr. Fernandez entered the room, looking exhausted but satisfied. He checked Ricardo's monitors, examined his pupils, tested his reflexes. Everything was functioning normally, miraculously normal considering what they had just gone through. "You are a lucky man," he said to Ricardo, "or rather, a blessed man, having someone like Josephine fighting for you." That made all the difference. Ricardo looked between Josephine and the doctor, understanding dawning in his eyes. "You risked everything to save me," he said to the doctor. "Why?" Dr. Fernandez looked at Josephine before answering. Because Josephine reminded me why I became a doctor, he said softly. To save lives, no matter how difficult it might be. And because everyone deserves a second chance. He paused, emotion crossing his face. I couldn't save her husband, but I could save you. In a way, that gave me my own second chance too. The doctor gently squeezed Josephine's shoulder. Thank you, he said simply, for making me remember. Josephine was now surrounded by two men who had found renewal through her simple insistence on doing what was right. Ricardo, who had learned about humanity, and Dr. Fernandez, who had rediscovered his vocation. She thought about everyone at the company who had witnessed the day's events, about how the ripples of their actions would spread. We all had our second chances today, she said softly. Now we need to do something good with them. Ricardo nodded weakly, his mind already working despite the exhaustion. The company, he said with sudden urgency. Josephine, the company is yours now. We need to. Josephine gently silenced him, placing a finger on his lips. The company can wait, she said firmly. Now you need to rest, recover. We'll have time to sort everything out. She paused, a mischievous smile appearing. After all, you've just gained more than 24 hours, haven't you? The sun was rising outside the hospital window, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Josephine, Ricardo, and Dr. Fernandez watched in silence for a moment, each lost in their own thoughts about the extraordinary day they had lived. It was a new dawn in every sense, literal and metaphorical. I'll use every extra day you've given me to make a difference, Ricardo promised, his voice gaining strength. I'll transform that company into something we can be proud of. 6 months later, Taylor Construction had 2 golden plaques in the presidency. Ricardo Taylor and Josephine Wilson, co-presidents. Josephine, who 6 months ago could barely pay rent, now managed a business empire alongside Ricardo. But the money never changed her essence. She remained the same humble woman, only now with resources to help many more people. The company had transformed into the national model of humanized management, with record profits, proving that treating people with dignity was the best business. Family, Ricardo said one morning, looking at Josephine as they reviewed reports together. That's what we've become, isn't it? Josephine smiled, that same warm smile that had saved his life on that fateful day. Real family, she agreed. The kind you choose not by blood but by love. They had filled the void in each other's lives. She, the family he never built. He, the true friend she never imagined having. Josephine had insisted on keeping the simple apartment where she lived, but now she could provide quality education for her grandchildren and proper medical care for everyone who needed it. Her happiness didn't come from money, but from being able to make a difference. Ricardo, in turn, had discovered that true wealth was in Sunday dinners at Josephine's modest home, in shared laughter, in decisions made together with conscience and purpose. The supervisor who fired her now led social projects, completely transformed. Dr. Fernandez visited monthly to check on Ricardo and had become a close friend to both. The company had created hundreds of dignified jobs and a program where no employee experienced hardship. Dr. Fernandez had published his revolutionary cardiac procedure, saving dozens of lives, and credited Josephine for making him return to surgery. The company had established a fund for medical treatments for employees and their families. You know what makes me happiest? Josephine asked, holding Ricardo's hand as she had done that day in the hospital. That we proved love and compassion can transform any situation. Ricardo squeezed her hand back. You gave me more than life, Josephine. You gave me a reason to live. 2 friends, 2 partners, 2 halves of an unlikely family that had rewritten all the rules about success, proving that the greatest fortune in the world is having someone who truly cares. Now tell me in the comments where you're from and tell me, did you like this story? Then subscribe to the channel, leave your like, and check out the next one waiting for you right here on the screen. I'll see you there.